You see China and Russia filling vacuums. It's concerning.
If China were to actually invade Taiwan, I feel like the temperature on the planet is so high right now, and the United States has its hands on so many things that, like, if Ukraine and Russia, we're already fighting over whether we support that. You've obviously got issues between Israel, Palestine, and supporting that. If China were to do something, I understand there's escalatory steps. I'm not saying a full-on invasion, but it feels like it would be really hard to garner domestic support for any sort of, because, oh, wow, we're going to China now too? Like, who else are we going to go to war with? Who else are we going to defend? They would worry about that.
Do we want the world to look more like how China runs things? You're talking about the possibility of World War III happening. I think it's getting more likely.
Do you feel like the United States would have more success doing foreign policy if we were a bit more, like, honest to our citizens about what our foreign policy means? Because I feel like, especially in the Iraq era, when we sell foreign policy to U.S. citizens, it's just kind of using, like, it's just the words freedom and democracy, and that's basically it. And I feel like veering away from that and saying anything different feels like a bad thing, but I feel like you could make very strong arguments for why supporting U.S. interests abroad, like, not only helps us in the United States, but can help the people there and can help people around the world. And I feel like we're very, I don't want to say dishonest, but I feel like we couch our language a lot in terms of leadership. Yeah, do you think that messaging would matter?
It would take the right person.
Okay.
It would take a really good communicator to do that, because I think there's reasons why the State Department communicates foreign policy in that way. It's run through hundreds of focus groups, I'm sure. I think that messaging is what resonates with the most people, and in saying the quiet part out loud, that kind of thing, it feels like that's what we should be doing, and that maybe that would be more effective. But I think if you want to appeal, when you're thinking about talking to 330 million Americans, you need to appeal
to as many of them as possible.
Yes, with a message that will appeal to as many people as possible. And saying, like, we need to invest in our interests overseas because, you know, if Ukraine's taken over, then it's going to cost us even more money. And if we start losing influence, then, and the dollar starts shaking, then this will hit your pocketbook, and your tax money that we're spending to support Ukraine right now will be nothing compared to what will happen if they take over Ukraine. That's a harder message to sell, I think.
It is harder. One thing that I worry, this is a very political direction, but one thing that is kind of frustrating me with the U.S. political system is I feel like we have used so much shorthand to explain what we're doing, whether we're talking domestically or internationally, that the shorthand is, like, taken over and destroyed our ability to actually evaluate fundamentally why we do a particular thing. So that might be, you know, it sounds silly, but, like, should women be able to vote? Like, I feel like people don't know the answer to that question anymore. So then you see in smaller spaces, like, these people have, like, repeal the 19th Amendment, or why do we have, you know, civil rights, or why do we have protected classes, or why do we have foreign policy aims that we do?
Why does our military spending matter?
Yeah, why do we waste so much money on the military? I'm sure you've heard this a billion times. Why do we waste so much money on the military? It's so stupid. And there are aspects of U.S. foreign policy that I think are really good and really cool. Like, if there are people that are shooting weapons into boats in the ocean, I like that the United States can sail the Navy over to Yemen and say, we're going to sit here next to these ships, and if you shoot anything, we're going to obliterate you with high precision. Unless something has changed, I don't believe any civilians were killed in any of the Yemen installation bombings, right? When the
U.S. government probably hasn't said that any have.
I don't think the Houthis said that they had, have they? You don't want to? Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't recall any of those, but I think that
they didn't target any. They targeted places that were ammo depots in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So
there's value in that.
And, like, who else is doing that? China didn't come and help resolve that.
I'm not even sure if China's Navy can make it that far yet.
They have a naval base in Djibouti right over there, so they could have helped out, but they're not going to do that. They don't want to be seen helping
firing
the United
weapons
States
because they're already trying
kind of
to,
on
like,
the axis of resistance, and Yemen's kind of falling into that, right?
Well, also trying to gain influence in too, because I think they were trying to broker deals between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they want to.
So to go back to, I do think it's a good thing that we question how much we spend on the military. I do think that it's natural to question why are we spending, I think it's $1 trillion now, when there's many people who are homeless and starving. Not that putting money into that would fix that problem. As we've learned, California dumps tons of money into their homeless problem and it doesn't solve it. But it's good that democracies, that we can have a sober discussion about, like, hey, is this the right thing to spend this much money on?
Yeah.
Should maybe our allies spend more on defense so that they can take a piece of that responsibility? I mean,
what do you think on that? I'm super curious, actually.
I think it's a good thing. I think countries should be more self-sufficient in their defense spending.
So you want other countries to spend more, and do you feel that we overspend?
I think they want to as well. I think it's difficult for them to make those changes in their budget. Poland is doing it. If you guys want to talk about the defense modernization programs of these different countries like Poland and Germany and France, and Britain, they're increasing their defense spending by billions of dollars, all of them now, because they're all spooked out. So yeah, I think it's good for them to spend more on defense, and maybe it would be good for the United States to be able to lower how much they spend on defense. That would be nice. Sure. Maybe right now they can't.
I guess my issue, my concern is that, like, when we have that conversation, it has to be done with the fundamental goals in mind. Because if the fundamental goals are misunderstood, then I think that the conversation veers into dumb places. Like, if the United States spends money on our military because we just enjoy bombing people overseas and so that we can pay for these corrupt military-industrial complex organizations to make a lot of money, we should cut our military spending by 90%. Why would we spend any money on it, right?
What are our fundamental goals?
What?
What are our fundamental goals? What should they be?
Yeah, I mean, like, being able to project power to guarantee trade routes is it's one of those things where it's like you don't need your immune system when you're not sick.
Right.
But if you don't have it, you're dead, right? Yeah. And I think that, people don't know what the world looks like without somebody guaranteeing passages for free trade. It's the ability to... One thing that people don't understand too is the ability to leverage allies. So, for instance, people think that it's bad that, whether you think it's good or bad that the United States supports Israel, supporting somebody means that you have more say in what they do. And just being supportive of somebody means you can also tell them to, like, hey, like, slow down a little bit, like, calm down, like, or we're not going to support you. And if we have that in hand, we have that control. Being able to project these things internationally, I think, is really important. And it's also important because there's very much like a game theory element where if you don't do it, somebody else will. And if the United States wants to say, we're going to be better than this, or we're not going to support, before we even finish that sentence, Russia and China is like, okay, well, we'll support them.
We'll do it, yeah.
Well, absolutely.
That's what we're seeing happening, I think. I think a little bit, we saw the United States...
China moving in with Ukraine and Russia a little bit.
After the United States went to Iraq and Afghanistan and pulled back and started sort of pulling off the world stage, you see China and Russia sort of filling vacuums. It's concerning. For one, personally, I think I hear that argument all the time. People will say, like, why do we spend so much on defense? And that there's a concern that the military-industrial complex is pulling the strings, and that we have this perverse incentive to keep war going on forever.
Right.
Okay, I get that argument, valid, but you also kind of have to explain away the fact... it's a valid concern.
It's just politicians can't get elected on the back of dead soldiers. Yeah. But sorry.
It's a valid concern, but I don't believe that we're at that point yet, because you'd have to explain the fact that why has U.S. military spending gone down several times over the last several decades. Since World War II, we've steadily decreased our spending in terms of a percentage of our GDP. So how do you explain that? If the military-industrial complex is truly keeping us at war all of the time, and there are arguments for it, how do you explain that there isn't more war, and that more of the budget isn't going to defense? There's been times where we have cut defense, slashed it, and cut troop numbers. So
I think my biggest pet peeve with that argument, and people don't go too deep into it because whatever, but like when you look at the actual size of these companies, the revenue that they're doing, it's dwarfed like several times over, like orders of magnitude, when you look at like our tech industry. And when like military conflict and stuff happens around the world and like energy prices are affected, everything, like if you were thinking that people were pulling the strings behind the economy of the United States, I would be looking at people like Apple and Facebook and Amazon, because these guys, their advertising budgets could account for the entire profit of like the entire military industrial complex. So the idea that a few companies with market caps of anywhere from 10 to 100 billion are pulling the strings, meanwhile Apple is sitting here with bank accounts larger than like the yearly revenue of like multiple of these companies combined, it drives me crazy.
Yeah.
And it ignores all of the other pressures for why we get involved, sometimes bad and sometimes good. with foreign conflicts as well. I think my biggest frustration with people that make bad arguments is that I think there are good arguments to be made against things sometimes, but we can't even get into those because there are so many dumb ones that you have to chew through first, and they can provide cover or legitimacy to one side, or they just hijack the conversations and then nothing happens at all.
Yeah. There's also the argument that we're not spending enough on defense, and you see the disrepair that our Navy is in, the disrepair that some of our military. So a lot of our equipment is from the 1970s. We're still using the same platforms. The M2 Bradley from the 1970s, the M1 Abrams from the 70s. Like there's an argument to be made that we need to spend more on defense.
I had a couple cop friends that would complain to me on the BLM era when they would see videos of the cops and some of these like kitted AR-15s that these guys have, and they're like, holy shit, this guy's like rifle is more than like the cost of my entire gear issued to me or whatever. Is like, yeah, the insane amount of spending for some of our police forces versus what, and they even buy shit from the military sometimes too, versus like what the military guys will get. Yeah,
there's a program where they can get a lot of that
at discount.
Decommissioned.
Oh,
that's
and it's
you see
cheaper,
the armored
I'm guessing,
vehicles and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm gonna.
Oh, yeah, go.
I have a question actually about China and Taiwan. So do you have stuff on that's not a derail?
Stuff relating to that? No, go for it.
Okay, so you said we should probably get into the axis of resistance. I know we've dug into it a little bit. Last time when Ryan was here, he said that he thinks China is going to invade Taiwan probably in the next like year or two. I'm super curious on your thoughts of that. Do you think that the tensions are at the point that China would be invading and kind of surrounding and going into Taiwan?
Yeah, actually, I think I listened to that talk that you had with Ryan. He was very insightful analysis that he added to that. And there was something that he brought up that I want to put a pin in about the Israel-Gaza incident. He was talking about, when I was talking to him briefly, he mentioned the Sons of Palestine, this idea of like, oh, maybe we could invest in a militia force inside Palestine to help to give them money, kind of like similar to what we did in Iraq.
What you're talking about with that,
but sorry. So with
I'll write that
with
down.
what the point that you guys were talking about with Taiwan, he was mentioning that there's a possibility that they could do something like a limited strike, like with ballistic missiles, like what we saw with Iran, what they recently did, which we could talk about that too. It's fascinating, but I do think that there's a threat, there's a chance. Is it high or is it likely or unlikely? That's kind of the multi-billion-dollar question that the intelligence agencies are working on right now. They're trying to figure out what is China's intentions. I think what Ryan said is a likely scenario that they do some kind of something just below the threshold of a full-on war. I don't know that it's in their interest to launch a full invasion, like how we saw with Ukraine. I don't know if that plays to they might take an island here or there in the Spratly Islands. They might take one of the disputed islands in the Philippines. There's a lot of steps basically that they can take on the escalation ladder, short of, okay, we're going to mass 1.5 million troops and we're going to put them on amphibious assault vehicles and we're going to spin up our civilian. There's this third sea force in China where, we have the Coast Guard and we have the Navy. They have the Coast Guard and the Navy, and then they have a civilian militia force of shipping vessels that are like fishing vessels that have weapons on them as well.
Which is why Chinese fishermen have been getting killed by Taiwanese people. Is that the connection
there? There are instances where they're ramming each other with boats, and you've probably seen where you have the water cannons on each other. Yeah, there's
a whole meta game behind boats that do international anything like fishing or whatever, where they have all these like fences they put up, the water cannons to prevent like pirates. That seems incredibly stressful. Holy shit!
It's crazy what's happening right now in the South China Sea. And so the Philippines there's a couple of the countries in this area have kind of made a decision already if they're going to ally with us, if they're going to ally with China, if they're going to be neutral. Indonesia, for instance, they're playing the neutral game. They've done that since the first Cold War, because I feel like we're in a second one now. But Taiwan is, what we're doing basically is we're doing a porcupine strategy. We're trying to send them billions of dollars worth of missiles and aircraft to basically to deter China, to make the cost of invading so high that they decide not to. And we would know months in advance if they were going to,
Right.
similar to how Ukraine, we saw them lined up and doing training exercises. We would see them line up on their shores and satellite imagery months in advance. And there's only like, I believe it's 2 or 3 times a year that the weather conditions allow for an invasion by an amphibious invasion.
Interesting. Okay.
Does that sea freeze over in the winter? Does it become?
It's not
Yeah,
that
what are the conditions?
my understanding is that there's the waves and the water are not conducive to these amphibious vehicles. Are
Like they just can't ground and get soldiers on land and
Yeah.
stuff? Okay.
Okay. Do you? I guess focusing then more on this. If China were to actually invade Taiwan, I feel like the temperature on the planet is so high right now, and the United States has its hands in so many things. I feel like my worry would be biggest right now that it's when it would happen, I guess. That like if Ukraine and Russia, we're already fighting over whether we support that. You've obviously got issues between Israel, Palestine, and supporting that. If China were to do something, I understand there's escalatory steps. I'm not saying a full-on invasion, but it feels like it would be really hard to garner like domestic support for any sort of, because, oh, wow, we're going to China now too. Like, who else are we going to go to war with? Who else are we going to defend? I worry. I would worry about that.
That, I think, is something that the American people are pretty, if I remember the polls correctly, they're more kind of down for that.
Sure.
Like, for some reason, not as much supportive of the war in Ukraine, but a lot of people appear to be, they understand kind of the threat that China poses. And we were talking about if the United States shrinks away from this world leadership position, like who's going to fill it?
Yeah.
Well, do we want the world to look more like how China runs things? Do we want their
It's scary
authoritarian
because
flavor?
as much as I hate to say it, I think I tweeted this out. I miss my neocons a little bit. I agree with what you were saying earlier, that having different people are good to fight with each other, because it's the tension is the important part, but we arrive at, I think, realistic political truths. And now that we have no more neocons, I think the left has always been, I say a tad more dovish, but I guess we had Syria and Libya under Obama, so for as dovish as that is. But the right was usually kind of like our more militant, like, we need to go do this, we need to go fight. And now under Trump, they feel a lot more isolationist, like, well, America first, let them deal with their stuff. So you don't have that big push from there anymore. The far left, obviously, like kids at school and social media, don't want to do anything foreign policy-wise. So then you kind of have like your center left, like your older liberals who are kind of like looking around, who are like, well, we used to be known for just like, I guess, fighting for gay marriage, and now we're also have to defend, aggressive U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. political landscape has changed so much. And then when you talk about like,
so you don't see like a yin and yang anymore?
It's flipped. When I was growing up, the conservatives you would have thought they were saying what you're hearing the liberal side say now.
I mentioned my mom was Cuban. Both my parents were in the Air Force. I heard so much crazy stuff about the Chi-Coms and Russia. I don't know if my mom ever called them Russia. I think she would always just say the Soviet Union and Putin, the KGB thug. And to hear even my parents today be like, well, I don't know if we should be supporting Ukraine, or I don't know if we should do this, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, if this was under Bush, my mom and dad would be like, don't even bring him back from Iraq. Our soldiers should go right up to Ukraine afterwards. And they should be marching to Moscow. We need to end what we should have in 91. We need to take them out completely. And it's like, yeah, the opinions on that flipped so quickly, so violently. I was not expecting that or ready for that.
So do you feel like, do you feel like there's no yin and yang, that like what Chris has described is like kind of like the American two-party system, which is that like you guys have this tension between the liberal and the conservative, and you kind of keep each other in check? Are you saying because the factions are so spread out,
there is no yin and yang. Now it's like yin and like tick, from like yin and yang and tic-tac-toe. We're like in totally different worlds. To bring it on back to the China-Taiwan thing, though, the worry that I have when so many conflicts are happening is, I wouldn't say right now everybody's like World War III, and I don't think we're on a path to World War III, because I think that all the parties involved so far are operating like they don't want World War III. I think that Russia at least is like, when they move their weapons, they saber rattle, but everybody can see them. Iran was like, after, like, while the missiles were leaving, they were like, we're done, we promise we're not attacking anymore. And then when Israel counterattacked, Iran was like, well, we didn't actually see that. And it feels like people are trying to be responsible, but especially like if conflict happens in China, my worry is that like the temperature is being turned up in so many different regions that it's like the pullout in Afghanistan, that like it only takes one really bad attack where it's like 200 soldiers are dead, where it's like now everything changes domestically, foreign policy wise, and I guess that's really scary to me, that a bad attack in a certain area could cause the U.S. opinion to hardcore swing in one direction or the other, and then everything changes for the worse.
Yeah, if you're talking about the possibility of World War III happening, I think it's getting more likely. I could see it happening.
Or even not that, the thing is, I could see it going either way, where it's like either World War III or it's like the United States' population is just like, we're actually totally done with
like
military
isolationist
stuff. I don't want to support
stuff.
anything anymore. Yeah.
I don't know. I guess it's possible. I don't know. A lot of times the American people, like, it's hard to put ourselves into that mindset of how we would think, but I do believe that what you would see is a little bit of that post 9/11 patriotism. If Taiwan was attacked, I think there would be that sense of camaraderie would come back. That sense of community
You really
might
think
come
so?
back.
Why
I
do
think
you
it's
think that
possible.
would-
I super disagree.
Yeah.
But
What
yeah.
happened in 9/11 is obviously a different example because we were attacked, but the support for Taiwan is high. The American people see China increasingly as an adversary. I'm not too worried. Plus, the United States military in that instance, it's not going to really be up to the American people if we defend Taiwan or not.
Right.
We're the leaders of the country are going to make that decision. And this has been a strong part of foreign policy for decades now. There's strategic ambiguity around whether or not we would defend Taiwan. And it's increasingly, you're seeing the foreign policy messaging is going more and more towards
I feel like it's clear that we would defend. I feel like that's what I see everywhere
They
now.
flat out have said it at this point.
Yeah.
And we thought maybe it was just a gaffe, but it's becoming more clear that no, this is a change in
patrolling
messaging.
in the China Sea that they're doing and stuff. Yeah.
I guess but the big worry is that like it took 2 years to tire us out of Ukraine, and we don't even have like soldiers there. It's been 6 months, and people are waiting on Israel. We don't have soldiers there. It feels like the appetite for any sort of like foreign stuff. But I live in like very toxic political circles. So maybe for the broader American public, maybe it's not the same.
It might be that, and that would, I think, be probably the wrong way to go.
Yeah, of course.
It would be, but also, if we're super rah and down to start World War III with China over Taiwan, is that a great thing too?
I think so.
It's so
to draw the line somewhere.
I think that's the issue, is that I think like if you had a greatest foreign policy mistake from Obama, do you have an opinion on what one would be?
Well, there's the red line.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, because the issue is, when people look at like whether or not you would start World War III, they think that the starting World War III is bad, but like other people could create the conditions such that it happens. And if you constantly let them do that and you don't enforce that, in a way, you're actually, it seems counterintuitive, but you're kind of the one that's, you're the one that's doing it, So I feel like at the end of the day, the United States, like, one of the big worries that I had, changing gears a little bit for Ukraine, Russia, is if you wanted to make a statement about not supporting Ukraine, and I think there are good arguments on both sides, I lean very heavily towards Ukraine, but something along the lines of like, there is no formal alliance here, it's not our obligation, we shouldn't be messing with non-aligned countries in such a hardcore way or intervening so much, fine. But the arguments are more that like, well, we could start World War III, and like, I don't know if it's a realistic, thing for them to defend themselves, and blah blah blah. The problem is every single argument that I hear used in mainstream arguments by politicians, by social media people, by pundits or whatever, would equally apply to the Baltics, would equally apply to a NATO country. Like, it's Estonia. Do we really want to risk like nuclear warfare for Latvia, for Lithuania? Like, come on, like, it's bordering Russia, like it's NATO encroachment.
Taiwan.
Yeah, and that scares me.
You could see them move the goalpost that way, but I think
or wouldn't even the argument would be NATO.
I mean, NATO is an alliance, whereas Ukraine's not part of NATO.
Yeah.
So I understand their thinking there.
Well, that's why that's the argument that I could understand. That like, okay, it's a non-aligned country. I understand. I get that.
Yeah.
But the like, well, what if we start World War III and the nukes start flying? Like, those could apply evenly to a NATO country too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what you would see them do. Is let's say hypothetically they take over Ukraine and then they're on the border with Poland. We would see them. They definitely would start hybrid warfare. They would start doing limited strikes. They would start testing our boundaries, essentially. And the reason I say that is because we pretty much did that to them when Ukraine was leaning towards wanting to be a part of the European Union, wanting to be a part of NATO. We were testing Russia's boundaries. We had the CIA on the border with Russia training Ukrainian special forces to attack Russian officers. So
Russian officers in the Donbass?
where they were occupied
Sure, yeah. Okay.
regions. Right.
Just to be clear on that, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are they fair game? Yeah.
Defense of Ukrainian territory is a bit, but
But
I
the
understand.
CIA
Yeah.
themselves were saying like we didn't want that to happen. We didn't want them to be using our training to attack Russian forces in 2015, 2016.
But also, Russian
So
forces should have
basically-
never been there.
Right. Yeah. No, there's counterpoints, but what I'm saying is like we did that. So if Russia were to be on the border with Poland, they would do the same stuff. They'd play the same games. They'd be attacking Polish officers. Yeah. And that's not tenable. That's why I think both sides see it as a existential crisis. They see it as a non-tenable situation, both of them. It's, I think, probably likely that we see something similar to what is happening in North Korea and South Korea, or has happened on that DMZ. It's probably going to be a DMZ in Ukraine. For where that front line ends, I don't know, but
Right.
that's my guess.
Do you have a strong opinion on kinetic responses to cyber warfare? Do you think that gets talked enough about? Do you think that we don't treat it seriously enough, or the military does, we don't talk about it? Or
France is investing, I think it's $5 billion extra into cyber warfare because they're one of the places that their infrastructure is getting attacked. I hear that there's ransomware being installed into a lot of infrastructure in the United States. I don't know a ton about the cyber piece. I know that it's a part of what this massive transformation that the Army's doing. It's called multi-domain task force. Like when I was in, it was a brigade combat team that they would deploy. Now they're changing it to multi-domain task forces, which have a cyber aspect to it.
we need a new military branch, like how Trump did the Space Force?
Cyber Force?
Cyber force.
Unironically.
Kind of though, right?
It is a big deal.
It is.
It's not its own military branch, but there's the Cyber Command that was established. All
Do
four
you-
branches populate it.
Yeah, I'm super curious. How do you see like cyber warfare specifically impacting like? Could you see it impacting like the average infantryman, or do you think we're going to see it more like a data kind of like higher level warfare?
No, I think that'd be at a very different level than the regular soldier's picture.
Yeah.
The scary stuff is, I think, the civilian infrastructure, right? It's the idea that China could theoretically like turn off a power plant or destroy like banking infrastructure is where like I think most of the attacks from China and Iran are usually said to be
Our
focused
power
on.
grid could be brought
stuff.
down really quickly.
Is that what's happening in France right now? Is
That's
like
what's happening, I think, in the
banks and
United
power grids?
States to some extent.
From what I heard, there's FBI reports that China has ransomware in our electrical grid.
Or even, I don't think it's not to get political again. It's impossible not to, but a lot of the stuff relating to Hillary Clinton's campaign and the email stuff, that the hacker that penetrated the DNC and was leaking like the Podesta emails and stuff, the Guccifer guy, I'm pretty sure people don't debate it. That was like a Kremlin operative essentially, right? This was stuff coming from Russia for a lot of these hacking attacks.
Yes.
Or that spear phishing from the Guccifer hacker, yeah. And that has like significant consequences politically.
I mean,
in the
politically,
United
it had
States.
a massive impact on Hillary Clinton, right?
Yeah.
Something that I wanted to bring up that I remember you mentioned earlier, if it's okay.
Yeah.
You were talking about the Gulf War and whether that was right or wrong. That I think is a really interesting period in. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah. It's a really interesting period because it was when the U.S. was we hadn't picture a time period when we hadn't made that mistake yet, where we hadn't kind of soured everybody to war. That was the Gulf War, and
we had the Soviet Union had collapsed. We were on top of the world. Germany.
We run this shit.
Yes.
That was our moment. That was like our 15 minutes, and I feel like we kind of blew it. But I think we're seeing.
What do you mean
now,
by that?
Well, by going to Iraq.
Because of
You think
Iraq.
the first Gulf War was a bad?
No, by going to Iraq the second time.
okay.
I'm saying the will was.
But what happened after that is interesting because what we started doing was a form of warfare that I think is more interesting than cyber warfare and all that. It's sanctions. We started doing sanction warfare. We started using economics as a tool of war for one of the first times against Iraq. And I think this is a little bit maybe part of the reason why we're seeing all these things happen today is the United States uses their economic weight. They throw it around. The world order that we live in today, it is so sweet for us. And I think that's why the axis of resistance is doing all of this now, is because they don't want the United States to be able to do that, to be able to hold that over their head, to be able to sanction you and basically destroy your economy just like that. We have that power. Who else has that power? Like this, I think, is why we're seeing this.
Sure, to some extent, yeah. It's kind of like earlier when I was talking about our ability to have leverage over, say, Israel because we provide them with funds. We have leverage economically over some countries being able to sanction. And it's one of the scary things about cutting all of those things off or engaging in all of those sanctions, because if you've completely released them from all of your economic grip, you've like basically unleashed them to do whatever they want.
To lose.
Like there was a lot of debate over the weaponization of SWIFT, the financial transactions, when it came to Russia. And it's like, well, are we really going to start cutting people off from this? And then if we do, well, what leverage do you have for anything now? And then if you weaponize these, does it make everybody kind of like look sideways at anything relating to finances? Like it kind of feels like when credit card processors like tried to attack porn or cut off like Pornhub and stuff in the United States. It's like, how is this even happening? Like, why is my financial transaction standardizations being used because Russia is at war and now I'm like a streamer in Moscow and I can't accept PayPal anymore? And the soft power. Yeah.
Right. I'm sure you probably knew people who were streaming in Russia who just like couldn't get paid anymore. I'm guessing, but yeah, that soft power aspect of it. It's what I think how I think the world order benefits the United States so much that I think people don't understand about this world order and don't understand about if we were to lose influence around the world, what power we would be losing.
Yeah.
And how that would eventually end up coming back and hitting their pocketbook.
Yeah. Or not just looking at the pocketbook too. People are very critical about soft power weaponization. But if you don't have soft power weaponization, then you have hard power weaponization, right? So if you can't bring somebody, under your thumb through economic sanctions, well, then you bomb them.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think people don't look at the alternatives, I feel like, all the time for how things could go.
Yeah. In many ways, like soft power is like the new evolution of warfare that like prevents deaths, essentially.
Kind of, yeah.
We can sanction you or we can like drop bombs on you.
I look at the progression of kind of like different world orders throughout history. I've been looking at that recently. I've also been looking at kind of how the world functions on a high level. Like for a period of time, there was imperialism, colonialism. Now there's this period of what's called neo-imperialism. Like imperialism, you would just go conquer a place, take their resources. Colonialism, you conquer, and then you send your people to live there. Neo-imperialism of today is kind of you
use
influence.
the IMF.
Exactly. Use the IMF. You influence these places, and it's so confusing and so hard to wrap your head around. And that's why I think it's so difficult to understand how damaging it would be if the United States, when you hear, oh, we're losing influence in Africa, it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I don't care. Well, these things matter. If the empire starts to fall apart, like look at what happened to the Dutch Empire. Their currency used to be the dollar. The Dutch currency, Britain too, the UK used to be the world currency, right? When their empire fell apart, what happened? Their currency fell apart. Right. So like, I don't know, maybe I'm reaching.
No, wait.
It's an interesting.
Wait, real quick. I agree with you 100%. But I like that you looped around it, because this was my initial argument before, where I was like, I wish that we were more honest about our foreign policy ends, because of what you just said. When you don't know why we have foreign policy, like, okay, well, we're losing influence in Africa, so what? No more blood diamonds, so you can't go exploit those poor people anymore. And it's like, well, no, now they're not going to be able to trade with us. Their lives are probably going to be measurably worse. And China and Russia, man, if you think the United States exploits people poorly, like, do I have a story to tell you? People will look at the U.S. and our involvement in Iraq and talk about how we killed, I think Saddam Hussein tried to claim 500,000 children because he was counting every child death or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, you brought up Chechnyan soldiers. Like, look at either of those wars. Look at Grozny, or look at Aleppo in Syria, or look at the type of warfare that these people conduct for like Russia and China. And yeah, I mean, like, the United States is not beyond reproach, but man, you're not substituting it for Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. You're going to be substituting it for a power that is far more brutal and far less responsive to the complaints that you have about how other people are treated. But yeah, I like that you brought up, like, well, why does it even matter? Because people don't know. So
your point is, why can't we just say that?
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Why can't we just say that?
Because we exert influence in good ways too, and people don't give us credit for that. When we talked about the most hated thing in the world, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and it was horrible because it undermined labor unions and workers, and these big trade deals are bad and blah blah blah. My understanding is Vietnam has walked back on basically everything, but they were on the verge of so many different workers' rights because they wanted to be part of that giant multilateral trade agreement. And part of that on our end was we want our workers to be competitive. So if you're going to trade with us, you need to not have slaves, okay? You can't pay 50 cents a day for your workers. You have to actually start to boost their wages. And that type of like positive influence is good for us. It's good for our pocketbooks. It's good for our influence around the world. And it's good for those other countries too, to some extent as well. Not to say that we're all noble, but
human rights has, it's been on the rise thanks to, I think, democracy. And it's hard to say these kind of quiet parts out loud, but like our influence around the world is also, you get UN votes. Who's voting on our side when it comes to anything at the UN? If we lose influence in countries in Africa, we also lose votes.
Yeah.
And that can have an effect on basically the world, the way the world's shaped, the way we see the world, and how we want people to interact with each other, like you're talking about, pay people what, a fair living wage versus what I would say the authoritarian vision of the world and what the world would look like if China were the leaders. I don't think it would be as good. I think it would be more Grozny's. But
like people are upset about like how social media is ran for censorship or whatever, right? And now we're finally seeing the diverging opinions on TikTok being owned by China. But like imagine also if Facebook was run by Saudi Arabia, and then imagine if like Amazon was run by Russia.
Yeah.
And then like the world could look so complete and you would have no say over these companies whatsoever. Like Americans, I think, take it for granted that we have so much cultural and economic domination over the world that we don't even stop and think for a second. Like, what does it mean that I can go to almost any city in the world and speak English? Or what does it mean that like my US dollar is valid for a currency exchange almost anywhere as an incredibly stable medium of currency? Why does everybody do business in dollars, denominated dollars? Like, I think it's a lot of taken for granted. You were going to ask questions too, sorry.
Yeah, I was just super interested. I feel like I've heard a lot of people connect the idea of military power to economics in how we're talking about specifically, but how much of like when people talk about spending, how much of our spending, because we have such a large and capable military, also keeps our dollar valuable because our military can back up our dollar?
Yeah, that's what a lot of people would say, that there's an argument that our military force, the reason we invest so much in it is to protect the dollar.
Right.
That's,
it's not
I've heard that argument.
It's military
right.
backed.
Yeah, I've heard that argument. I agree. I think I sound a little bit like I'm making a case for imperialism and American empire, but I would say that all the great powers do it. China does it. Russia does it. They do it in different ways. All of these powers, you see Russia right now, they're moving in quite literally into Niger, where the U.S. military just got kicked out of. So imperialism, neo-imperialism, which is our influence through culture, through
embassies and trade.
Right, military bases here and there. China's doing the same thing. They have police stations all over the world. And
they build ports that people can't afford the payments on and then take them over and exclusively staff them with their own workers.
And they're trying to set up BRICS a little bit to be in competition with the US dollar. Nah. And so I don't know exactly to the degree that the US military backs that. I think I've looked into it and I've tried to kind of quantify it and dig deeper into the numbers, and it's kind of a nebulous thing. It's like how do you quantify that?
Yeah.
But it's a very good question.
Yeah. Too, right? Because it's essentially saying like, well, we value you, your cultural hegemon, and your like dollar because you can kind of stomp us. Or if we're in dire straits, you can help us out.
The one thing that the United States did after World War II that I think was really, really great was the Marshall Plan, where we gave billions of dollars to help rebuild Europe. Like, I don't know that other countries, given the amount of power that the United States had, would go so long without abusing it. And the United States, I think when they first started abusing it was probably the war in Iraq, is one of the first cases that I see, like a clear, real, just terrible abuse of kind of, we took advantage of that position of being kind of on top.
I'll say, I think the world grew and learned, because I think the world kind of changed how they did foreign power. So for instance, you mentioned that like the different eras, we had like the colonialist era where people wanted colonies in places, after they moved on from taking them over. I would say that like after World War I, if you look at like Britain and France's application of mandates in the Middle East, they realized that, like, okay, well, we don't want to run these places forever, and we probably don't even want to do colonization, so we'll eventually turn it over. And I think the United States in general has been pretty, like, we did our manifest destiny, we got our country, and then, like, we're chill. But because I know there are people raging right now, the subversive foreign policy that we had in the Cold War was probably not the best, but I think other countries might have done it more aggressively. Like what we did in South America, there was a lot of intervention there. It's probably not great, but I think other countries would have just taken those countries over.
I would like to talk about Latin America.
Okay.
If you guys are down to talk about Latin America.
Yeah.
So right now, Haiti is a whole
Crazy.
cluster.
Yes.
Excuse me. And there's a whole history of colonialism there, where France went, turned them into sugar plantation, then brought in 800,000 African slaves, then country fought for their independence. But for the Cold War aspect of Latin America is fascinating, because you look at a place like El Salvador, where we pumped $1 billion worth of arms into El Salvador during the Cold War, and the Soviet Union and Iraq and a couple other countries, they pumped something like a couple $1 million worth of arms for the guerrilla fighters there in El Salvador. And then what you saw happen was this boomerang blowback, as the CIA would call it, where so we fund these what they call death squads in El Salvador, and then those we train them as well, and those El Salvador trained and stood up by the Americans, they then commit all these war crimes in the El Salvador Civil War. And then they go to the United States, and they end up becoming, have you heard of MS-13? So that's where MS-13 comes from, is El Salvador. And then we deport them out of America back to El Salvador. And then El Salvador becomes this gang haven over the decades. And
like
it's
Haiti
like,
is now.
And it's like, okay, so I get what people's point there would be, which is that look what U.S. influence did in a place like El Salvador. It's not pretty. So yeah, I'm sympathetic
I would say,
to that.
I think we have to be careful though, and people have a hard time with this. Retrospective analysis is so much different than prospective analysis, because obviously the goal or the idea at the time is that wouldn't happen. But I would be cautious, because earlier, so right now we're talking about the idea is we should train some people to stand up against others because we feel like they'll represent our interests more with the death squads in El Salvador. We kind of signed off on that same idea earlier for the Sons of Palestine, where it's like, well, maybe if we train these fighters in the Middle East, they'll do better against this faction in the Middle East we don't like, kind of like we did with the Mujahideen, right? Maybe we could do it in Palestine. Maybe this time it'll work out. Sometimes it does kind of work out. And I think we don't get credit for those times. Everybody will use the Vietnam War as an example of a horrible U.S. war that we should have never been in. And it's like, maybe not. There are good, arguments on both sides of that. But a lot of the arguments that you would use against Vietnam, you would have used against the Korean War. And damn, South Korea is amazing. Holy shit. This is why I argued earlier that, like, I hate that Iraq was so up, because now Iraq becomes the lens that we analyze every foreign policy decision through. And it's like, well, do we want Ukraine to look like another Iraq? And it's like, Ukraine doesn't look anything like Iraq. Okay. In Iraq, we had to bullshit ourselves into thinking the people wanted America to come there. In Ukraine, Zelensky is begging the United States for help. And the people in Ukraine want to fight against Russia with like every fiber of their being. It's not even remotely comparable. Yeah.
Can I ask us a grounded question? I'm so sorry, I'm going to pause this. I noticed that we've talked about Iraq a bunch and how it's failing, but I just want to maybe do a TLDR so that like listeners who are maybe not familiar understand like what went wrong about Iraq. Like we keep citing it as like the point. So what was so wrong about it?
From a geopolitical perspective, we basically made Iran more powerful by toppling their adversary. We changed the balance of power in the Middle East, which then led to there's the uprisings in Syria, which destabilized essentially the whole region. Like you looking back on it with a sober, clear mind, you have that sober analysis, and you're like, oh boy, Syria and Iran and Iraq, everyone there must have just looked at the U.S. troop presence there and thought, where are they going next? They going into Syria? Are they going into invade Iran? Those were fears that those countries had. We destabilized that whole region, which then helped, I believe, and I'm sure there's counter arguments, but I believe it's part of what led to ISIS being able to form in the vacuum of power in Syria, which then trampled through Iraq. I remember when a couple of years after I got back from Iraq, I saw a news article about the base that I had been at in Mushada had been overrun by ISIS. And I was like, oh, so that was all for nothing. That was the year I was there was just so that ISIS could go and take it over. And then we beat them back, which thank God for that. But Iraq was a geopolitical disaster, I think, in some aspects because of the destabilizing effect. And that's not, we didn't go in there wanting to destabilize.
Right. Anything that you would add?
Yeah, I to this day, I don't know why we did the Iraq war.
I think we got slapped pretty hard from 9/11, and we thought
it felt like Bush could have thrown a dart. I understand Afghanistan and the Taliban and Al Qaeda. I don't understand Iraq, but the big issue with Iraq was we basically, I think one issue you run into is it's called feature creep in software development, mission creep, I guess, in the military world, is that we didn't have a clear mission initially. So like, what are we here to do? Because it wasn't just to get rid of Saddam Hussein, it was also all the stuff that came after.
Right.
But there's a whole bunch of reasons, and I don't know why. Maybe I'm just analyzing this now as a civilian who, like, I have the luxury of like sitting in a fucking podcast studio and analyzing it. But because I see this come up a lot with Israel Palestine, people project way too much their desires and their mode of existence onto other people, and they make way too many assumptions, and in some ways it leads them to being way too arrogant and way too misinformed about what another people want. Being for Iraq, our understanding as enlightened liberals in the West is that everybody wants a democracy, and that would be the best way to go about everything. So if we topple some dictatorship and we give them a democracy, they're going to be grateful for it, they're going to love us, they're going to be our friends, and it's going to be great. And the way that we went about, and again, I'm retrospectively analyzing it, the way that we went about it is we essentially went in, we took apart the entire government, and you already had a situation where arguably you had like a minority kind of suppressing a majority, because the Ba'ath Party, although it was supposed to be a secular dictatorship, I think it was generally staffed by Sunni people,
Sunnis,
right?
yeah.
And you have a majority Shia population, so now you're flipping the script, which I think also led to predictable things like death and torture camps and shit for now some of the other population, now that the Shia people came in power. I think under Maliki, I think a lot of that happened. But you took apart the government. You said if you were in the government, you're not allowed to ever participate in new government. So those people got banned. You brought in a new government, and there was just no clear roadmap or direction for what the fuck was going to happen afterwards.
Right.
And you're already in a region where there are so many people that want to have influence or push or have like some say in what's going on here, because you've got the whole IRGC is dedicated, your Quds Force, your Soleimanis who are like, well, I want to have a lot of influence in Iraq, and now you destroyed it. And then you've got your Baghdadis from Syria who are like, oh my God, there's so many places for my fighters to train.
Yeah.
You've got a whole ethnic group of Kurdish people there who are scattered among the Middle East who are like, can we have a country here now? Like, what's going on? And it just felt like very stupid. I don't know, but again, I have the vision, the luxury of retrospect. But
I have a tendency to do a lot sometimes of black and white thinking, and I'll say to boil it down, I'll say that like Iraq was a disaster and it was a mistake. I'm sure that there's some people who benefited and their lives are probably better now
like
because of it in Iraq.
Yeah.
But I would say on a whole,
it was terrible for the region, the area, and the people.
There's estimates that something like 1 million civilians were killed during the 15 years we were there. I don't know if that's accurate. I wouldn't be surprised.
I think those numbers are a little wild. I know that there's one that gets thrown around a lot.
We flattened some of those cities.
But there were warnings for evacuations, everything first. It's not like we just came in and carpet bombed the fuck
that's one of the things I think is different between Gaza and Iraq, is that the people could leave Fallujah, for instance, but
more readily,
they can't as easily leave places in Gaza. Real quick to end the Latin America aspect of it, I think some of the decisions, like we're not responsible entirely for whatever instability or violence,
and everybody had their hands on those countries too.
Cartels, cartel violence. Spain was a colonial power there for hundreds of years and basically left them with economies that were dependent on one product. So El Salvador, for instance, was entirely dependent on coffee. That was their only economic product. So there's a lot of places that you could blame for that, but I think what we're seeing is all of those problems are coming home now to roost at the border. The problems there.
I was going to say the cartel is such an interesting conversation, because my understanding is one of the largest cartels in Mexico right now. One of the head guys was trained by U.S. military.
There was something called the Meridia Initiative, where the U.S. gave billions of dollars to Mexico to help train their forces to fight against the cartel. And there's, I think it's the Los Gatos, Cats. It's the Cats cartel.
Sure.
Los Zatos. I have it wrong, but one of the cartels is largely from people who are out of that initiative. But yeah, the cartel problem is crazy. You see Ecuador just recently, I don't know if you saw that, their government falling apart, or their gangs, prison breaks happening. And it's because, so what we're seeing is this spilling over of cartels into different countries that before 3 years ago were very peaceful. So I wanted to kind of put it, end what I was trying to say about Latin America.
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting because it ties really well into understanding the immigration crisis that we're experiencing at the border specifically. When you look at all the cartels and the fighting that's going on, there's a lot of people saying like why there are just so many more people at the border. But probably part of it is I don't think most people are even aware of what's going on in most of Latin America. I don't think most people even understand that like Haiti's basically fallen. I don't think there's any established government at this point. Whereas El Salvador just got that new authoritarian guy who basically like militaried out
Bukele.
All of the criminals, right?
The President Bukele, who he rounded up 70,000 criminals and put them in prison and created giant prison camps, and people love him because now they can go outside freely and not have to worry about being attacked by gangs. So the border, I don't know how interested you guys are about the border.